So a few months ago, the Arch team started packaging an Arch install script in their official ISOs, which kind of functions as a automated way of installing kind of like a base, real vanilla version of Arch. It doesn't give you a whole lot of options in customizing the experience or fine-tuning your installation, but it gets the job done in a pinch, and it doesn't require a lot of knowledge coming into it. It doesn't require a lot of reading on the Arch Wiki to get going with an Arch installation. I think that tool is great. I've used it several times myself. I really applaud the team that's putting that together, and I'm happy that Arch is making their distribution more accessible for lay people. But I gotta say, it really pales in comparison to the Anarchy Installer. And I just want to show you what the Anarchy Installer is and how it works today, because I've used the Anarchy installers several times, and it's such a great tool. It's a really wonderful tool. So I'm here on their GitLab. You can see, if you scroll over here, Anarchy Installer GitLab IO has a little bit about them, some frequently asked questions. I think this one is the most important. Anarchy Installer is not a distribution. It installs Arch. So it's not like Endeavor OS or Arch Labs or Manjaro. This is just Arch. It's not a distribution. And it's a nice little text-based interface. It doesn't use the Calamares installer or any of the other modern installers to get the job done. It's all via text. It's really clean, really tight, and really well put together. So let's go ahead and jump into it. All right, so I have the Anarchy installer booted into a virtual machine right now. This is going to be the screen you're welcomed with, selecting your language. You guys can scroll down, select whatever's most appropriate for you. I'll select English. Selecting your keyboard layout, I'm going to select the United States, so scroll down to US. A little blurb here about the Anarchy installer. Feel free to read about it. He recommends coming to Arch Linux, the wiki, to reference things. It's a good idea to do that because when you follow along the Anarchy installer with the Arch wiki, personally for me, it helped me make sense a little bit more of what the installation wiki was trying to tell me early on in my Arch career experience. All right, so first thing you're going to want to do is update the key map here. And so this is going to take a couple seconds. At this point, it might ask you to activate your internet, your Wi-Fi. If you're on Wi-Fi, I'm hardwired since I'm on a virtual machine. So if you do that, it'll be a little text-based prompt. You enter your password, activate the connection, hit end, and then you come to this screen where you'll refresh your keys and update your databases. All right, so once that's complete, you'll be met with this screen here to update your mirror list. You can do it manually, you can skip it. I don't recommend either of those two. I would just download and rank new mirrors. This uses the reflector passage. This is the reflector package, and this is what the Arch Wiki recommends using anyway when you're setting your mirrors. So I would just select the first one, download it, and rank new mirrors. So now that we have our mirrors set up properly, it's going to take you through some settings, local settings, time settings, that sort of stuff. So your desired locale, I'm in the United States. Obviously, you would select whatever corresponds to your region. And your time zone, same thing over here. I'm going to scroll all the way down. I'm in the US, but you can scroll through these, find whatever is appropriate for you. I'm going to select US. And since I'm in Los Angeles, I'm going to select Pacific. So we get to the partition point now. This is actually a really powerful tool they've included with Anarchy. The auto partition drive does a real basic partition table. It gives you the option to set up your boot drive, your boot drive or boot partition, set up a swap partition, and set up your home partition. You can do those all manually if you know how, or if you'd like something a little bit more specific to you. I've done it a couple times where I did a manual partition, but for this one, I'm just going to do the auto partition because it's going to get the job that I want done. So I'm going to select auto partition. I'm going to select my drive here. The only one available is my SDA. And now you can select your file system here. Again, really powerful tools that they've included. It doesn't just default to ext4, although that's probably what I would recommend if you don't know what the other file systems do. But if you're coming into Arch for the first time kind of new, or you're coming into Linux for the first time kind of new, and you don't really know that you have options for different file systems, just seeing them available or seeing them listed out like this can kind of give you a jumping off point to research some of these file systems on your own and see if they might be more appropriate for what you're trying to do. For most home usage cases, ext4 is probably fine. I know Btrfs, the B-tree file system, is really, really popular right now. It's kind of in fashion, but if you're not using Btrfs correctly or for its intended purpose, you're kind of missing the benefit of installing it anyway. So I would just say ext4. At this point, you can create your swap file. It recommends a certain amount of space. When you read like historical uses of the swap file, they recommend doubling your RAM. Most computers now are shipping with 8 to 16, maybe even 32 gigabytes of RAM, and most people aren't in danger of running out of memory on their system, especially on Linux. So unless you're doing something really RAM intensive, you probably don't need a swap file, but just so you can see it happen, we'll create one right here. We'll just say yes, and we'll just leave it at the default 512. You can change this using M for megabytes or G for gigabytes. You know, let's just set it to 2 gigabytes there. Would you like to use GPT partitioning? I always say no to this. You guys can research this on your own and see if it's appropriate for the system that you're trying to install, but I pass over that one. It now gives you a little bit of a review on how you're about to partition your drive. At this point, it will zap your drive and you will lose all your data, so make sure you're ready to move forward. Make sure you have everything that you need backed up on your system before you write the changes. So that all looks good to me. I'm going to write the changes, and I'm going to hit enter. So after our partition table was written, we have the option to install some desktop environments, some window managers, or get a little bit deeper into the Anarchy Installer. If you're new to the game, you can install this first one here, Anarchy Desktop. It's a quick desktop install. This almost does function like a distribution. It comes with a lot of packages that the maintainer of Anarchy thinks are important or are enough to get people moving. It's still pretty minimal compared to some other distributions, but there's some quality of life tweaks, there's some theming applied. It might not be exactly what you want. I was kind of a little disappointed with how they were laid out, these desktop environments, and I felt a little bit bloated with some of the packages that were pre-installed. So I started coming down here to Anarchy Advanced, which kind of functions similarly to the Manjaro Architect. So you can get pretty deep into the weeds with Anarchy Advanced, so I'll just teach you, or I'll take you through what I would consider like a typical setup. But again, your options: quick install, long-term support install, server install, long-term support server install, and then doing things manually. So selecting your kernel here, again, for the people coming to Linux for the first time who aren't really super familiar with what a kernel even is, it's nice to see some options laid out in front of you because it gives you a good way to just start researching things on your own. Right? When you're coming into the game new, you don't know what you don't know, and the wiki, the official Arch wiki, can kind of be a little intimidating because there's so many different hyperlinks, so many different threads you can follow that you kind of start to lose track of what it is you're even trying to do. So just having like, oh wow, there's more kernels here. There's different versions of the Linux kernel that are available. I don't know what the Zen kernel is. Let's go look that up. That's an important thing. I think it's a valuable thing just to have that laid out during the installation process. For most users, I would recommend the vanilla kernel, just the basic Linux kernel with base devel. So the base devel package gives you some developer controls, developer options. Most important for me, it gives me access to the fake root environment, so I can install an AUR helper called Yay, which I use to grab a lot of packages from the Arch user repository. So I would select one of these first two. as a new user using this tool, either the vanilla base or the vanilla kernel with the base devel. Here you can select your command shell. This is going to be the language your terminal speaks or your terminal emulator speaks. Bash is the default. Bash is the most common one. Bash is usually what ships with most distributions. I prefer to use the Z shell just because I like some of the plugins that the Z shell offers, and I like the theming that the Z shell provides through Oh My Zish. So I would recommend going with Z shell or Bash, but feel free, again, you have them listed here to research some of them on your own and see what's more appropriate for you. All right. Desired ZSH configuration, I select just clean. I like to configure it myself, but if you'd like, the default Anarchy theming is actually pretty solid. It's colorful. It has some plugins already built in, like auto suggestions and highlighter. So if you prefer to have some of that work done for you, the default is pretty good. But for this installation, I'm going to select none. Your bootloader, I would select Grub here. The one downside about the Anarchy installer is it doesn't give you an option to just use systemd boot, which I think is a weakness because systemd is already packaged with pretty much every distribution at this point, and I kind of don't see the need to install Grub unless you're going to be dual booting operating systems, especially like Linux and Microsoft. But I would use Grub in this situation. Grub is like second in line. Well, actually, I think probably Grub is more common than even systemd boot. But again, I just like using the tools that were already provided. But here we go with Grub. Definitely use Network Manager to manage your networks. That's kind of like the standard at this point. And then I have a 64-bit architecture, so it's going to ask me if I want to install a couple of packages. To kind of facilitate that, I'm going to hit yes here. Enable DHCP at boot, recommended, dynamic host control protocol, automatic IP address configuration. You want to do this so you don't have to do that manually. Install wireless utilities, provides Wi-Fi support necessary for connecting to Wi-Fi. Yes, you want that, especially if you're using Wi-Fi. Install OS Prober. So if you're multi-booting, if you're dual booting, if you have like a Microsoft or a Windows installation or a couple of Linux installations, you're going to want the OS Prober just so Grub can pick that up and you guys can select whatever whatever operating system you want to boot into. I don't need to do that right now. I'm on a virtual machine, and so I'm going to select no. Would you like to install a desktop or window manager? Yes, most of us probably do, so we don't just get dropped into a command line and have to do that ourselves. You know, or what would be the point of using the Anarchy installer otherwise? You know what I mean? So let's hit yes here. And so the options you have, the customized desktop environments are the ones that we had access to previous in the installation, the ones that are already kind of pre-configured and come with some packages. I'd recommend steering away from these and just going with a vanilla installation, which is going to be the second option here, clean desktop environments. These ones are going to be what ships with the Arch packages. So if you were installing Arch from their official ISO and you want to install Gnome and you type in, sudo pacman-s Gnome and you just get the meta packages associated with that, this is what that's going to do. It's just going to be the vanilla Gnome experience or the vanilla KDE experience. And then down here we have window managers. This is stuff like the i3 window manager, Sway, Awesome OS, or whatever it's called. It's not a full-fledged desktop environment. It's just something to populate and manage your windows, usually tiling window managers. For most users, you probably don't want a tiling window manager. It's a very specific use case for a very specific set of demographics, usually people in IT or people who are in and out of the terminal really frequently. Most, I would say, day-to-day desktop users coming from Mac OS or Windows probably want to stay away from the tiling window managers. So let's come over here to the clean desktop environments and see what our options are. Again, as a new Linux user, you might not really understand the relationship between your kernel, your desktop environment and what a distribution is. So seeing some of these laid out, some of these desktop environments laid out in a list form can kind of give you a little bit of insight to just what the options are and what the more popular ones are. So these are in alphabetical order. These aren't listed by popularity or recommendation. Budgie, just go through them pretty quick. Budgie is a custom desktop environment, I think by Solus is how you pronounce it. It's really heavily reliant on the Gnome stack. It's basically Gnome, but stripped down, a little bit cleaner, less bloated. Cinnamon is the desktop environment that ships with, I believe, Linux Mint. It's a really clean, really nice, kind of has a Windows 10 vibe. Dpin is the desktop environment from the distribution Dpin. It's gorgeous. It doesn't work that well on Arch. There's a lot of hiccups with it. I don't recommend it on Arch unless you're willing to do a lot of troubleshooting. Also, the maintainers of Dpin are kind of sketch, so I'm going to leave it at that. Gnome is Gnome. This is probably what most people think of when they come to Linux as the default distribution or the default desktop environment. Gnome Classic is more along the lines of Gnome 2. KDE Plasma is KDE Plasma. This is the one that I think is probably most popular among the average to power user until you get to the window managers of the Linux community. Most people probably end up in KDE Plasma because it offers them a little bit more depth and customization that Gnome is kind of lacking. LXDE, LXQT, and XFCE, these three here are really minimal desktops. These are what I would recommend on computers with limited resources. You know, you don't have as much processing power or as much RAM, but you need to get something rolling. It's not resource hungry, but they do kind of look a little bit dated. They look like they're desktop environments from the early 2000s up through like 2010, that era. And then you have Mate or Mate, which is also based on Gnome 2. It's actually pretty similar, I think, to classic Gnome, but it has some quality of life improvements and it looks a little bit more modern. So for this installation, I'm just going to select Gnome. I think that's probably what most people who are new to the game should select because it really limits your options. It doesn't throw too much at you too fast and kind of gets you used to the whole Linux paradigm. So to select it, just press the space button. It'll put an asterisk next to it. Now you can select multiple desktop environments here. I would strongly recommend against doing this. When you start installing multiple desktop environments, some of those configuration settings start to clash and it just creates problems. So I always recommend one desktop environment for one installation. You can always uninstall your desktop environment and the dependencies and install a new one if you want, but I wouldn't recommend installing multiple desktop environments in one go. So let's select Gnome, scroll down, and hit Done. Install Gnome Extras. I recommend against doing this. This is going to install a ton of packages, most of which you don't need. Like most people don't need Gnome Chess, you know? So I would, all the packages you need for a fully functioning desktop environment have already been selected. These are everything that goes above and beyond. I don't need it. I think it's bloat. I would recommend against installing this, but if you want to see what it's included, go ahead and install it and just try it out for yourself. I'm going to select No here. Virtual machine install. Yeah, this isn't going to be applicable for you, but I have to hit OK here. Would you like to install these input touchpad drivers? It's not really necessary. I think the drivers included or the support included by Gnome by default are already pretty solid, but I would always recommend hitting yes here anyway, just because it's going to pick those drivers out that are specific to your touchpad drivers or to your touchpad. Would you like to install a GDM or a graphical login manager, display manager? Yes, you need to do this. Since we installed Gnome, we're going to select the Gnome Display Manager, GDM. If you're installing KDE, I would recommend installing SDDM. That's kind of what KDE works with. And then for all other use cases, I would install the Light DM. So your three, I really wouldn't recommend LXDM. Your mileage may vary. But the three that I would recommend is for Gnome, install GDM. For KDE, SDDM. And everything else, Light DM. So I'm going to hit Enter on GDM. And now we get to configure a little bit of our users and our root settings. So the root name is going to be Arch for me. I'm going to set my password. And then it's going to ask me to create a new user. So I'm going to scroll down here, create a user, Ambro, set my, there we go. Set my password, set my password. It's going to write all of that. Yes, I want to enable sudo privileges. So for those of you guys who are new to the game, sudo privileges, the analog in Windows would be administrator privileges. So it gives you access to the root environment, which might not mean a whole lot to you as a Windows user, but it gives you access to configure and tamper with files that normally you shouldn't have access to. And if you select no here, you won't have access to them on your account. You'd have to go through the root login. So I always give myself sudo privileges, even though I don't recommend running them a whole lot unless you know what you're doing. And then you can always add more users if you'd like, but then hit done. Would you like to install some common software? If you hit yes here, it'll take you through, like, oh, let's just show you. So you get some audio software, some database software, all the way through here. So if you kind of know what you're already looking for, you can select, like, say you want Firefox. Come down here to Internet, press Enter. You can just put spaces next to the stuff you want. And I want Firefox, so I'm going to put an asterisk there. Scroll down and hit OK. And then you can continue to add more packages doing the same thing, or you can just hit install and move on. So I don't need any more packages. I always prefer to do this once I'm in my environment anyway, but if you want to install it beforehand, you can use this feature to do that. So one last thing here, it's going to show you what you're installing, the download size, how long it's going to take to install, and the packages it's going to install. So once you hit this, everything we did up to this point from the time we created our partition table to the time that we're going to hit install, that's all going to be applied and installed on your system. So go ahead and hit install, and the rest Anarchy will take care of. All right, so that's the Anarchy installer. I recommend just giving it a whirl, seeing what it's all about. If you're new to Arch Linux or you're new to Linux in general, but you heard that you want to get involved with Arch Linux, I think the Anarchy installer is a great tool to get going with that. I personally love the Anarchy installer, and the maintainers are doing a fabulous job with it. It's not something I use a whole lot anymore because I just tend to use the official ISO now, but I think it is a great tool, and if it's available to us, I think it's worth it to use. So thank you guys for giving it a watch, and I'll see you on the next video.